Designing for lasting change that goes to scale has been the work of Kevin Starr and the Mulago Foundation over the last 25 years. And this post is a step-by-step summary of that approach to designing for impact at scale. And although this is intended for, quote, social entrepreneurs, you can really borrow most of these principles and apply them in standard for-profit businesses. Just a word, the content, the ideas, the images, and the blog post are all taken from different talks given by Kevin Starr on YouTube. And so if I screw anything up, let me know and I'll try to fix it. And I highly recommend that you go back and you watch the original videos and the original talks where this derives from. And I realized kind of after writing this piece that a lot of this content is also available in the blog section of the Mulago website. And so you can read it there as well. Part of the reason that this blog came about, or this particular post, was that I had read and reviewed the book Lean Impact by Anmei Chang. And that book was published in 2018, and she mentions Kevin Starr's name in passing in one of the later chapters. But after really diving into these ideas, it seems to my perception that Kevin Starr has been talking about this for easily over a decade prior to that book's publication. And so I feel a lot of these ideas regarding the analogy of how impact is the way which you would measure the analogy of profit in a business, and that the return on investment is really the cost of that impact. These core fundamental principles really, I think, are more attributable to Kevin Starr and the Mulago Foundation than Anmei Chang. As Kevin Starr says, businesses are ruthless about designing for profit. You have to be the same about designing for impact. And so what we'll outline here is a seven-step process, which starts with clarifying the mission, then understanding the big idea, then building for outcome and impact, tracing a behavior map, and creating interventions to drive each of the behaviors on that map. We'll look at some behavioral change, understanding the emotion, the calculation and bias and ability of the person, and then build an impact model to deliver that intervention and understand how you can scale it by figuring out who the doer and the payer at scale is. Well, before we get going, I think the thing to realize is that this process we're going to discuss is specifically for projects that are designed to scale. And there are many worthwhile projects that are not designed to scale. And back in college, Kevin had read the book Small is Beautiful and really became interested for a while in creating small jewels of projects. However, as he became more interested in impact and lasting impact, his approach to scale entirely changed. And he began to see that really scale was beautiful. And so not all projects need to be scaled, but it's important for you to realize ahead of time the type of a project that you're getting into. So let's start in then on step one, clarify the mission. And this is really the first and most important step of the whole process, which is clarifying the mission. And the problem is that most mission statements are rather useless. And they just have a bunch of buzzwords like grassroots and empower and sustain and innovative and participative and capacity building and stakeholders. They don't really tell you much. And so instead, Kevin proposes that you should have an 8-word or less mission statement. And this needs to include a verb, a target population, and an outcome. Now, the target population might also be a setting or a species. And that outcome is the thing which you're trying to measure. And so the key thing with the mission statement is that this really has nothing to do with the idea of how it will happen or why it should happen. The mission statement is really the what you want to happen. And it needs to be specific enough to focus the organization, but it also needs to be ambitious enough to build a vision at scale. And it's certainly okay if different organizations actually share the same mission statement. That's normal. And so from this perspective, there's a certain amount of generalizability of the mission statement. So a few examples of mission statements: save coral reefs in Micronesia, save kids' lives in Liberia, get African farmers out of extreme poverty, get clean water to poor people, improve the health of the poor, get poor people more money, improve living standards in poor communities, prevent childhood malaria in remote African villages. Again, these each have a verb, a target population setting or species, and then the outcome, which is ultimately the thing which can be measured. And a few tips when you're building these mission statements. The verb needs to be really assertive and clear. And often the word get actually is a really acceptable and just fine word to use, Kevin says. For instance, get clean water to people is better than provide access to clean water. One of the other problems with providing access or to anything is that it doesn't actually mean that people will get it. And so get is a far better descriptor. The mission needs to be the state you want to leave people in. And so empowering people is not an end state. The end state is, do people have more money? Well, then that should be the mission. The mission ideally could be phrased in a positive way. For instance, create healthy reefs rather than the negative, such as end reef destruction. And in clarifying the mission, it can be helpful to reflect why perhaps you did this thing in the first place, why you decided to leave your old job, what it is that you find important, which is the problem you're trying to solve. If there's one part of this expression which is the least important, that's the actual verb. Usually that target population and your outcome will capture a lot of the idea you're trying to get, such as healthy reefs in Indonesia. And, don't use any of the words on the banned word list from Kevin. These are words such as empowerment, sustainability, impactful, access. They're too vague, too overused, and too imprecise to actually tell you what you're trying to do. So write your mission then at the top of the page. And as Kevin says, this mission is your success or failure statement. If you accomplish this, you succeed. If you don't, you fail. And so you need to be ruthless towards trying to do one thing well. And you might find that you have multiple potential mission statements, and you should choose the mission statement which is going to have the biggest impact. So for instance, in the area of cook stoves, perhaps the mission was to reduce CO2 emissions, or perhaps the mission was to save labor, or to save money, or to prevent deforestation. Well, these all had marginal and limited evidence of the impact of those missions. But if the mission was to improve health, well, the cook stove actually had a significant ability to deliver on that. So that's what then becomes the mission statement. The second step is to understand the big idea. And this is really the how. It's how you will execute the mission. And what you want to be able to do is to summarize down this mission statement, this big idea, into an elegant short expression or an elegant short idea. If you can't elicitate the big idea in a very short phrase or sentence or two, it's probably too complicated to be able to replicate at scale. And so right then the big idea right underneath the mission. And now you move into understanding what the outcome is. And if you could measure only one specific outcome to determine the success of the mission, you need to find out what would that be. And how much you change this outcome determines your impact. And so your impact then is what happens with you minus what would have happened without you. If the same observable outcome could have happened without you, you've had really no impact. Impact is the change in the state of the world brought about by an intervention. It is the final result of behaviors, outcomes that are generated by activities, outputs that are driven by resources, inputs. If your organization, for instance, was increasing access to mobile phones in Africa, you might report success because over 5 years, more people had mobile phones. But in fact, if you found that your organization actually had no different in the area where they were working versus areas which had no impact from your organization, then you really actually haven't had a measurable impact on the outcome. And so the measurability of this is really critical. One concept to consider is the impact jackpot. And when you're deploying an idea into the population, you want to see where the intervention would yield the highest impact possible. And by that, that's the difference between the impact with the intervention versus the outcome without the intervention. And usually, you're going to have the highest delta here when you're targeting an intervention for the poor. It probably is going to have the potential for the largest impact. And generally, if the poor can access something, it means the rich will be able to afford it as well. Or similarly, if you're measuring childhood mortality, there's likely a chance that adults or youth may become healthier as well because of the intervention. And so focusing on the impact jackpot likely might be a good surrogate for other groups and let you refine your approach. And so write your outcome at the very bottom of the page. And again, this is the outcome which, if fulfilled, will capture your mission. And you need to be able to get real numbers to measure that outcome. It has to be objective. And if you're having trouble determining an outcome, perhaps it's because the mission is too broad, or perhaps you just aren't an expert in that area. And so a few examples. First, I'll give the mission statement, and then I'll give the outcome. Save blue whales in Sri Lanka, more blue whales in Sri Lanka. Get farmers out of extreme poverty, farmers have more income. Get clean water to poor people, people drinking only clean water. And that's outcome is people drinking only clean water is better than better access to water, because again, having access to water isn't actually the outcome you're looking for. And perhaps Kevin suggested what you might want to do is actually go and change the mission from get clean water to poor people to prevent waterborne disease, because this is going to impact the type of water you need to drink on a consistent basis. If the mission was to prevent HIV infection in Brazil, you're measuring a decrease in HIV infection rates. If the goal is to improve health for rural poor, perhaps the outcome is better disease outcomes. So we now move on to step 4, which is the behavior map. And if impact, which is that desired outcome, comes from someone doing something different, you need to be very clear and understand who exactly has to do what exactly differently for the desired outcome and impact to happen. And this is where the behavior map comes in. And so each behavior should be written as a single sentence. For instance, mothers in rural households have to use the cook stove exclusively. The precision of the behavior is important. For instance, with cook stoves, it was discovered that you only see a benefit if you use it every time and if the cook stove removes 90% of the pollutants from the air. And that's why the behavior sentence states that the mothers in rural households have to use the cook stove exclusively. And so now that you've written at the bottom of the page already the outcome, what you want to do is outline every behavior in a row that needs to be connected together in order to make that outcome or to arrive at that outcome. So for instance, if you were trying to increase the nutrition in kids' foods because your mission was healthier kids, your behavioral map might include a miller who has to get the milling device, they have to obtain a nutrition powder, they have to use a device to mix in just the right amount of nutrient powder, and then they have to sell that fortified flour. Then parents have to be able to buy the premium flour, then they have to feed it to their kids, and then the kids have to eat the enriched flour. And so this is all the different behaviors that have to happen. Or in the case of 1 acre farm, they have to first recruit farmer groups, they have to sign them up for loans, they have to train farmers, they have to distribute inputs, they have to support them through the cycle, then they have to have their produce bought, and then collect repayment. Or if you're selling cook stoves, you have to get a stove, you have to get the fuel, you have to use it exclusively, you have to know how to start it the right way, you have to ventilate it enough, and you have to get it fixed. And the key thing with behavior maps are you want to have as few steps as possible in order to get to the outcome, but you can't have any leaps of faith between steps. There has to be a logical flow between how each step proceeds to the following step and how that proceeds to your impact and the outcome. Generally, Kevin says that having more than 6 steps won't work. Ideally, you want to have 6 or fewer, because each step will require an intervention to achieve the change in behavior, and having more than 6 likely just becomes too difficult. And it's important to realize 2 very key things. One, you only want to outline in the behavior map things that are outside of your control, meaning essentially that you can't hire or fire the person. If you can hire or fire them, that means they work within your organization and you can control that factor. And so the purpose of the behavior map is to outline factors that are outside of your scope of control that you need to have an impact on. The second thing is that this behavior map is really tracing things that people do. It's not things that people feel or people think, but it's really the actions. It's things that happen with their hands, not things that happen between their ears. All right, now we have the behavior map. The next thing is to match an intervention to each behavior. And so the intervention is the specific way that behavior will be changed from the current state to the desired state. It's the thing that you do. And so for each behavior, a corresponding intervention is mapped. And so if you had all of your behaviors written down the left side of the page, you can map horizontally across each behavior the intervention. And within each intervention, you want to consider the conditions. Can it happen? And can you make those conditions easy to happen? You want to know what the incentives are to see if it will happen. And you want to ideally tap into pre-existing demand. And you want to know if these conditions and if these incentives are going to last. And so, for instance, if you had a condition and incentive which involved flooding aid money into a community to purchase your intervention, well, that probably is not going to last. And so that would be the weak part with that intervention. Just some general tips when selecting an intervention. Sometimes one intervention may change several behaviors. That's normal. Sometimes the behaviors will actually be changed by other organizations, either other agencies or governments, and that's okay if that's who's responsible for changing the behavior, but your job as an organization is to ensure that that does happen. And the interventions, again, result in actions. These are things people do with their hands. The interventions don't change the way that people think. Changing feelings might be required along the way, but it's not enough. And ideally, good entrepreneurs get excited about the prospect of continually improving the interventions to make them more cost-efficient, effective, scalable, and cheaper. It's just some general tips for behavioral change, because really what these interventions are changing people's behavior. Kevin points out that the success of the interventions will depend on how people currently feel about the intervention and how you can make them feel better about it and how you can make the intervention easier for them. And there are 3 dials which you can adjust to try to optimize this equation. The first is the emotion or the heart. And how do people feel about the action? Do they have a positive emotion or a negative emotion? In general, you want people to have a positive emotion towards the intervention. It's going to be very hard to overcome a negative emotion. Sometimes you may need to evoke a danger emotion to alert people to something. And this emotion can be driven by 4 drivers, essentially status, fairness, belonging, and safety. With status, it's the question of, does this intervention increase or decrease my own, my family, or my community status? The second is fairness. Would anyone be perceived as losing because of this intervention, either within my family or within my community? And generally, this is a very strong deterrent if there's seen that there are losers or that there's not fairness. And this is, of course, one of the big problems with giveaways, in that it's unfair to some people in the community. So it's much better to bring up the entire community together. The third driver of emotion is belonging. And the question is, does this increase or decrease the belonging to their community or group? And finally, safety. Because people are generally risk averse, does the intervention increase emotional, physical, and cultural safety? The second dial is calculation and biases. Although people generally make their decision based on their emotion, people will try to reason for their decision based on calculations. But these calculations that people make are often based on biases. And so it's important that your cost-benefit ratio for your intervention is favorable, not when it's only observed by people objectively, but also when people observe your cost-benefit ratio using the biases that they have. Now, if you go onto Wikipedia, you can find dozens of cognitive biases. Some of the ones that Kevin points out are confirmation bias. People often want to hold on to an idea if it confirms pre-existing ideas. Or availability bias. People are influenced by the most recent information and events. There's, of course, the sunk cost fallacy, where people will remain with something even if they shouldn't continue to use it. And so the thing to realize is that people might have unrational biases that they bring to the table when they try to do an intellectual cost to benefit ratio of why they should or should not use your intervention. And so you need to understand what people's biases are and be able to address them head on. And the third dial is ability. And so if the first emotion was heart, if the second calculation of bias was head, ability is hands. And the thought would be that if dial 1 and dial 2 work, then people want to go and change their behavior. But the question is, are they able to? And can you make it easier for them to do the right thing? And you could do this by either increasing their internal ability, which might be, for instance, taking a large task and making it into smaller chunks which are easier to start, or making something a habit, or tapping into the herd mentality, because if everyone else is already doing something, it might be easier to get someone else motivated. And so in addition to this internal motivation, you can also increase someone's external ability to do something. So you might physically make it easier to do the right thing, or you might get actually physically harder to accomplish the wrong thing in the way that you design the product, or you might design the product to mirror similar other types of products that people are familiar with, again, just to make it easier. And we now move on to step 6, which is your impact model. In this case, the model is that systematic process by which you take the intervention and to achieve the outcome. And so the model is really the machine which is replicating the activities outlined in the behavior map. It needs to be systematic, it needs to be replicable, it needs to be activities that can be done frequently, and you need to iterate upon these activities. And it's helpful when you're designing this model to know step 7, which is the next model, who the payer and who the doer will be, because this is going to really influence the model you're going to build. And ultimately, the model informs the type of organization you should build. Who do you hire? Is it for-profit? Is it non-profit? These are questions which your impact model that you design are going to elucidate. Kevin points out that ideally, you want your impact model to have something which is called narrative attribution. You want the model to be so straightforward that the intervention and the model lead to an outcome in which there's no other explanation on how that outcome occurred other than through your intervention. So for instance, if you put up a fence and you kept animals from grazing grasses on one side of the fence and came back in 6 months and saw that the grass had grown back, this is a very compelling narrative attribution model. Other times you can't do this, and so in those cases you need to have a matched control to demonstrate that the model is working. And so in that case, for instance, 1 Acre Fund will find farmers who matched to the farmers that they're working with and demonstrate that the farmers they aren't working with perform poor. And then they actually go in and use those farmers in their next round of crop season growing to deploy their intervention and show an increase in their productivity. And then finally, you might need randomized control trials where you have many variables to overcome and low frequency events. But again, if you can demonstrate a narrative attribution model regarding your impact model, it just really makes things simpler. And often there's tension to change your model. And so Kevin says that you really need to tell funders this is what we do, and ideally have the money follow. But if you try to follow the money, in the course of doing so, you'll have to change your model, which will mean that the solutions you're designing for likely aren't going to scale or be designed for impact anymore. And so the best organizations lead and the money follows. And we finally now get to the end part, which is step 7, scale. Scale happens after you have the initial idea, after it's undergone research and development, after it's proven impact, and after it's proven a scalable model. And so it sounds like scale is really happening at the end. However, one should think about scale from the start and design from the beginning interventions which are designed to scale. And ideally, you want to know as soon as possible who the doer at scale will be and who the payer at scale will be, so that you can both design for this and test it. When you start thinking about scale, Kevin often asks organizations to consider what 1 million looks like. And so the 1 million is a completely arbitrary number, but it might be, for instance, 1 million children educated, or 1 million hectares preserved of ocean, or it might be 1 million patients treated. And so after starting with 1 million, you might consider what 10 million looks like, and then you might consider what 1 billion looks like. And the way that founders react and respond to this type of thinking at scale is kind of a good indicator to Kevin on whether that person might have the potential to achieve it. Is the thought of operating at scale exciting to them? Well, this, of course, is a favorable response. So let's look now at this concept of doer at scale. Who are the doers at scale? Who is going to do, deliver, and replicate the model at scale? There's only 4 options to do this at large scale. You, lots of businesses, lots of NGOs, or the government. When it comes to whether your organization can be able to do it all at scale, it's generally, this is rare, and it's usually only found in very highly leveraged interventions. So typically these are things happening in the digital space. And the number of these types of interventions is far more rare than people think. The second doer at scale is lots of businesses. And so in this case, you have a model that enables autonomous businesses to adopt and implement that model while creating a profit. It has to be a good business. Marginal businesses don't scale. And it works best when increasing profit in the business leads to more impact. For instance, if a company grows eucalyptus trees as a cash crop and sells them, if those trees are grown on poor people's farms, the more trees the company sells, the more poor farmers will receive funds for growing the trees. And so this is the type of alignment of profit and impact which one's looking for. The third doer is lots of NGOs. And it's important to realize that NGOs are actually notoriously bad at delivering other people's models. And so therefore, if other NGOs are the target doer, the model really needs to be very simple to be able to successfully scale. And last is the government. And government definitely has a mandate to implement interventions at scale that have a huge benefit across many people. And the interventions, though, have to be super simple in order for this to scale successfully. And so ideally, you really only want to pick one category of doer. And it's hard to design for multiple doer categories at scale. And you want to know this as soon as possible. We now move on to the payer at scale. Who is going to pay for the model at scale? Where does the revenue come from? And again, there are really only 4 options. One, either customers buy it. Again, this model is possible to build if you can, because it aligns your doer and your payer. But the reality is, often when working with the very, very poor, you're in settings of market and government failure, and that's probably there probably isn't a market immediately available. Second is government taxes. It's important to keep in mind, though, that many poor countries don't have enough taxes to afford interventions, and therefore most basic services in poor countries are provided by big aid. And so the third payer is big aid, such as USAID or DFID or the World Bank. And these organizations generally avoid paying for anything until it's ready to scale. Their job really is to take interventions and to scale them up. And finally, you have private philanthropy. And so, of course, the advantage of private philanthropy is that it's far more flexible and risk tolerant, but it often can't take ideas past a particular point of growth and scale. And so that's where you need either big aid or government taxes or customers to come in. Finally, what you might want to do is conduct a scalability audit, and this is trying to judge your ability to scale based on three things. One, is the idea broad enough? Are there enough settings where that model can be replicated? Or is the model really only designed for a limited number of settings around the world? The second question is it simple enough, the model? Often it won't work if the model isn't simple enough. And this is frequently seen when scaling a model, and when secondary groups begin to implement it, they often will fail to achieve the same high impact that the original group did. And so this is usually a sign of perhaps the intervention and the model being too complicated. And the third is the model cheap enough? Or if it is a profitable business, is the business profitable enough? You must really understand what the payer's price point is and what the payer is currently paying, what they're willing to pay, and ideally try to find a price point that perhaps that you could beat by several fold if you want to really see your intervention be adopted. And so there it is. There's the 7 steps, or at least I've outlined it in 7 steps, to being able to design lasting impact at scale, as proposed by Kevin Starr and the Mulago Foundation. If you're interested, again, I recommend watching the original videos linked at the bottom of this post of Kevin Starr teaching this approach. You can also find articles on the Mulago blog and website, and a little bit about their foundation. It was formed to continue the work of Rainer Arnold, who was a pediatrician from San Francisco who had dedicated his life to working with most humanitarian crises in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And the Mulago Foundation looks to find the best solutions to the biggest problems in the poorest places. And what they do is provide unrestricted funding to organizations with a pathway to scale. And the reason that the funding is unrestricted is, well, if you don't believe an organization can use funding better than you know, you probably shouldn't be giving them funding in the first place. And then they offer 2 types of fellow programs. One are the Rainer Fellows, which are more focused on scalable solutions to poverty, and the other are the Henry Fellows, which are more focused on scalable conservation solutions. So anyway, very interesting approach. Again, I think this is a useful activity to do by anyone working in either a standard for-profit business or a more of a social impact business. And I think this approach of really creating a deliberate mission, which is attached to an outcome which can be measured, which is driven by a set of 6 or less behaviors that can all be impacted upon, is a very deliberate way to understand how to build a model. Thank you.